Which quarterback should you start in week 3? Don't worry, SI's fantasy analyst Michael Fabiano is here to help you build a winning lineup. Fabs, who are the quarterbacks that can carry your team in week 3?
I'm really liking Matt Ryan this week. I loved him last week. He's a guy who's second in pass attempts per game right now at the quarterback position. And the matchup might not be great on paper against Chicago, but keep in mind in week 1, they should have gave up over 20 fantasy points to Matthew Stafford, but DeAndre Swift dropped that touchdown. And then last week, they played Daniel Jones, who was without Saquon Barkley, and that Giants offense just sort of fell apart. I feel like Ryan is virtually matchup proof at home. This is a crazy stat. He has averaged over 20 fantasy points per game at home in even numbered seasons since 2016. Matt Ryan loves even numbered seasons. I don't know why. It's a trend, but keep him in your lineup. And then Ryan Tannehill, he's Rodney Dangerfield. He doesn't get enough respect from the fantasy community. He was tremendous last week, almost 27 fantasy points against the Jaguars. Amazingly, he now ranks 3rd among quarterbacks in fantasy points scored per game since week 8 of last season. 3rd. I mean, that is tremendous. I like the matchup this week against Minnesota. They've given up an average of over 20 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks in their first 2 weeks.
Tannehill at 3. That's impressive. I like him too. All right, let's talk about dislikes, though. Kirk Cousins had 3 interceptions in week 2 versus the Colts. I know he's on your sit-on list, but why Tom Brady?
Did you watch Tom Brady last week? I mean, he scored fewer than 10 fantasy points against the Panthers. And in week 1, if it weren't for a rushing touchdown, he would have gave you a stinker as well. Hey, Tom Brady's the GOAT. He's probably the greatest quarterback that's ever been on a gridiron. But he's 43 years old, and he is showing it. Let's look at the numbers as well. 8.7 fantasy points last week, right? He doesn't rank in the top 20 right now among quarterbacks in air yards or completion percentage. And I understand that Denver's defense is a bit banged up right now, but I do feel like, Kaitlin, there are better options on the waiver wire. Even Ryan Tannehill's on the waiver wire. Gardner Minshew might be on the waiver wire. Like these guys better than Tom Brady. There are certainly better options out there. And then Kirk Cousins. I mean, you want to talk about a stinker. Last week, I had more fantasy points than Kirk Cousins. Kaitlin, you had more fantasy points than Kirk Cousins. He has now scored fewer than 14 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games, dating back to last season, during which time he's had 1 or fewer touchdown passes 4 times. This week, he's got the Titans. They've given up an average of fewer than 16 fantasy points per game to home quarterbacks since last season. Fantasy owners, we don't like that, and we don't like Kirk Cousins this week.
And for Sports Illustrated's award-winning weekly player rankings, get your membership to SA Fantasy Plus for just $14.99 a month. I promise you, you will make your money back and then some.